My name is Lisa. I'm 27 years old. For the first 30 years of my life, I thought my job was to be a human shock absorber. I honestly believed my purpose in my own family was to soak up their anxieties, their frustrations, and their disappointments, and to do it all with a smile. Every family dinner, every holiday, every single phone call felt like a performance review where I was always failing to meet some unspoken standard. I was a burden, a problem to be managed, an inconvenience to be tolerated. And the heaviest part wasn't just the feeling itself. It was the constant, soul-crushing effort of trying to explain my way out of it. Have you ever found yourself in a conversation, heart pounding, palms sweating, meticulously laying out the reasons for a decision you've made, only to be met with a blank stare? You explain your career choice, your partner, why you can't make it to a last-minute family thing. You build your case like a lawyer, complete with evidence and emotional appeals, just hoping that this time, finally, they'll get it. That this time, they'll see you. But they don't. The verdict is always the same. You're difficult, you're selfish, you're just not getting it right. For years, that was my reality. My family, the people who were supposed to be my safe harbor, was the one place I felt most judged and least seen. I was the family scapegoat, the person who was somehow responsible for all the tension and dysfunction. It was a role assigned to me so early on, I didn't even realize I was playing it. I just knew I felt small and perpetually in the wrong. I spent decades justifying my own existence, believing that if I could just find the right words or the perfect explanation, they'd finally stop treating me like a weight they had to carry. But I was wrong. The magic wasn't in explaining more. It was in stopping altogether. This is the story of how I took my power back, not by shouting louder, but by falling silent. It's the story of how no became a complete sentence and how, in doing so, I finally learned to breathe again. The feeling of being a burden is a quiet, creeping poison. It doesn't announce itself with a bang. It seeps into your bones over years of subtle hints and not so subtle criticisms. For me, it started when I was a kid. I was sensitive, and in my family, sensitivity was treated like a character flaw. My joys were too loud, my sorrows too dramatic, my questions too much. I learned early on to shrink myself, to constantly read the emotional temperature of the room. If my dad was stressed about work, it was my job not to add to his plate. If my mom was upset with a neighbor, it was my job to be the perfect, easy child to make her life simpler. My needs were secondary, my feelings were an inconvenience. That taught me a devastating lesson. Your worth is conditional. You are loved as long as you are not a problem. As I got older, this pattern just got deeper. Every major life decision became a negotiation, not with myself, but with my family's expected reaction. When I chose to major in English Lit instead of something practical like business, it wasn't a celebration. It was a week-long trial where I had to defend myself against accusations of being unrealistic. I literally made spreadsheets with potential career paths for English majors. I printed articles about successful authors. I was pleading my case not for their approval, but just for their acceptance. I just wanted them to stop looking at me with that familiar face of worried disappointment. It was the same when I moved into my first apartment. It was too far. It was in the wrong neighborhood. It was too expensive. Every comment, disguised as concern, felt like a judgment on my ability to be an adult. So, I explained, I showed them my budget, proving I could afford it. I pulled up on crime stats for the area to prove it was safe. I timed the commute to their house to show them it wasn't that far. I was constantly on defense, trying to justify a life I was actually proud of. These interactions were exhausting. It was profound emotional labor. Each phone call required me to brace for battle. Each visit meant preparing a mental script of justifications for my life. I remember one Christmas so vividly. I'd just been promoted at work, a job I loved in publishing. I was excited to share the news. But when I did, the first question wasn't congratulations. It was, does that mean you'll have to work even longer hours? You know you never call us enough as it is. Instantly, my achievement was reframed as another way I was failing them. The joy just evaporated, replaced by that old, familiar need to explain. No, the hours are manageable. Actually, this role gives me more flexibility. The words just tumbled out, desperate and appeasing. I was trapped in a cycle. Their criticism would trigger my fear of being a burden, and that fear would force me to over-explain myself. But my justifications were never actually heard. They were seen as arguments, as defensiveness, as more proof that I was, in fact, difficult. It was a game I could never win because the rules were designed for me to lose. They weren't looking for an explanation. They were looking for control. And every time I engaged, every time I pleaded my case, I was handing them the power they wanted, reinforcing the idea that my life was subject to their approval. My constant explaining wasn't building bridges. It was building my own cage. The job of the family scapegoat is to carry the weight of everyone else's unacknowledged pain. I was the designated container for all the family's anxieties. My life became a screen onto which they projected their own fears, their unmet dreams, and their rigid ideas of success. These expectations were a crushing weight, a set of invisible bars that defined the right way to live. Anytime I stepped outside those bars, I was met with anything, from subtle disappointment to outright condemnation. The expectations were relentless and often made no sense. I was supposed to be ambitious and successful, but not in a way that made anyone else uncomfortable or took me too far away. When I was struggling financially in my early 20s, I was criticized for not having a better job. But when I finally landed a demanding role that I loved, I was criticized for being a workaholic who was neglecting family. There was no winning. The goalposts were always moving, which guaranteed I was always falling short. Intrusive questions were how they delivered these expectations. Holidays were the worst. I'd sit at the dinner table just bracing for the interrogation. "Are you seeing anyone?" If I said no, I got pitying looks and unsolicited advice. If I said yes, a whole new line of questioning would start. What does he do? Is it serious? When do we meet him? My love life wasn't my own. It was a group project where everyone had an opinion. My finances were another favorite topic. How much are you paying in rent? That seems like a lot. Are you saving anything? Your cousin just put a down payment on a house. These weren't real questions. They were comparisons designed to make me feel inadequate, to remind me that I was on the wrong track. Even my body was up for discussion. A few pounds gained brought, "You have to watch that. It creeps up on you." A few pounds lost brought, "You're getting too thin. Are you eating enough?" My physical self was just another part of my life that needed their management and commentary. But the most suffocating expectation was the demand for my time and energy, and only on their terms. I was expected to be available at a moment's notice for a family crisis, to drop everything to help a sibling move, to be at every single family function, no matter how draining. But my own need for space or rest was seen as an insult. A decision to spend a holiday with friends was interpreted not as self-care, but as a rejection. It was more evidence. She thinks she's too good for us now. This created a constant, low-grade anxiety. My phone would buzz, and my stomach would just clench. Was this a simple hello, or was it a summons? Was it a real question, or the start of another interrogation? I was living in a reactive state, always anticipating the next judgment, always preparing my next defense. My life didn't feel like my own. It felt like a performance for an audience I could never, ever please. I was shouldering the responsibility for their feelings. If they were worried, it was my job to soothe them. If they were disappointed, it was my job to fix it. I had been taught that my own needs were a burden, so prioritizing their emotional comfort over my own well-being felt normal. It felt like love. But it wasn't. It was control, and it was slowly erasing me. I was becoming a ghost in my own life, just a collection of explanations with no solid self at the center. For every person trapped in a dysfunctional cycle, there's a moment, A moment so heavy with the weight of I've had enough that it changes everything. It's not always some big cinematic explosion. More often, it's a quiet internal snap. The sound of a single wire, stretched too thin for too long, finally giving way. My snap happened on a Tuesday. It was a totally ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was at my desk, trying to hit a deadline, when my phone rang. It was my mom. Her voice was frantic. My aunt had decided to host a last-minute emergency family dinner that Friday. The emergency? My cousin had broken up with his girlfriend of 6 months, and everyone needed to rally around him. I was told, not asked, to be there. You have to come, my mom said. It's family. My whole body tensed up. My heart started to pound in that familiar, frantic way. Friday was impossible. I had a huge work project due, and my boss had made it clear the team needed to be available that evening to see it through. But more than that, a deeper part of me just rebelled. I was so tired. Tired of these manufactured crises. Tired of the expectation that my life, my career, my time, my sanity was infinitely interruptible. My mind immediately started doing what it was trained to do, build the perfect explanation. I started mentally drafting the speech. I'd explain how important the project was, my boss's expectations, how I couldn't let my team down. I'd express my deep regret and send my love to my cousin. I'd promise to call him over the weekend. I would perform the perfect dance of apology and justification. And then, something inside me just broke. I looked at the email from my boss on my screen, at the project files spread across my desk. I felt the deep, bone-weary exhaustion from years of this dance. And I thought, no, I am not doing this again. A strange calm washed over me. It was the calm of being absolutely certain. I realized in that moment that no explanation would ever be good enough. A bulletproof reason for my absence wouldn't be met with understanding. It would just be picked apart. Can't you just leave a little early? Is your job really more important than family? My explanation wasn't the key. It was the invitation. It was the opening for guilt-tripping and manipulation. I took a deep breath. My mom was still on the line, waiting. I won't be able to make it, I said. The silence on the other end was deafening. It stretched for what felt like a full minute. I could feel her waiting for the because. She was waiting for the apology, the justification, the song and dance, but I didn't give it to her. I just stayed quiet. I let the no hang in the air, a complete sentence. It was the most terrifying and liberating thing I had ever done. What do you mean you can't make it? She finally sputtered, her voice laced with disbelief. This was it, the moment of truth. My old self would have caved and launched into the script, but the woman on the phone that day was someone new. That day just doesn't work for me, I said, my voice steady, betraying the tremor I felt inside. But it's for your cousin. It's family. She pressed, her voice raising. I understand, I said, and I'm sorry, but I won't be there. I wasn't cold. I wasn't aggressive, but I was firm. I was a closed door. I was no longer offering a crack for them to jam their foot in. I was giving myself permission to protect my energy and honor my own life. I was realizing that a boundary isn't a weapon. It's a shield to protect your own peace. The conversation ended awkwardly. My mom was clearly angry. She hung up without saying goodbye. For a second, a wave of panic and guilt washed over me. What have I done? But then, something else replaced it. A deep, quiet sense of power. Not power over others, but power over myself. For the first time, I hadn't let someone else's emotional reaction dictate my actions. I hadn't set myself on fire to keep them warm. I sat at my desk for a long time after that call, my heart still beating fast, but for a different reason. It wasn't anxiety, it was adrenaline. The beat of revolution. I had no idea what would happen next, but I knew, with a certainty that resonated in my soul, that I could never go back. That simple, unexplained no was the first brick I laid in the foundation of a new life. Setting a boundary for the first time is like setting off a flare in the dark. For a moment, you can see everything clearly, but that flare also lets everyone know that something has changed. The system has been disrupted, and the system will fight to restore the old order. The week after my two-sentence no was a masterclass in what psychologists call an extinction burst. That dramatic explosion of bad behavior when a previously rewarded action is no longer working. The first attack was guilt. My mother, after a day of silence, started sending a barrage of texts. They were full of passive-aggressive comments about family loyalty and how disappointed everyone was. "Your poor aunt is so hurt," one read. "I guess we just know where we stand now." Every message was designed to trigger my guilt and make me feel responsible for their feelings. In the past, this would have crushed me. I would have called, apologized, and caved. But this time, I saw it for what it was, a manipulation tactic. I read the texts, felt the discomfort, and I did not reply. When guilt tripping didn't work, the flying monkeys came next. That's a term for the people a manipulator recruits to do their dirty work. My sister called. Her approach was different, masked as concern. "Hey, Mom's really upset," she began. "Are you okay? It's not like you to just blow off the family." She was playing the mediator, the reasonable one, but her goal was the same. She wanted an explanation. She wanted the justification my mother didn't get. I stuck to my new script. "I'm fine," I said. "I appreciate you calling, but I've already talked to Mom. I'm not going to be there on Friday." "But why?" she pushed. "Just tell me why. It's so weird." "It doesn't work for me," I repeated calmly. "I'm not going to discuss it further." Her tone shifted instantly. "You're being so selfish. You're tearing this family apart over one dinner." The mask of the caring sister had slipped, revealing the enforcer underneath. She hung up on me. The final and most brutal wave was the direct confrontation. My father called. He was the family's heavy artillery, saved for when all else failed. He went straight to anger and blame. He accused me of being disrespectful, ungrateful, and having a bad attitude. He brought up things from years ago, painting this picture of me as a perpetually difficult child who grew into a problem adult. It was character assassination, a classic gaslighting technique. "You always have to be the center of attention," he boomed. "You always make things difficult." This was the hardest test. His anger was a force of nature I had spent my life trying to avoid. I could feel myself starting to tremble, the old impulse to apologize screaming in my head. But then I remembered why I was doing this. I was doing this because his version of me wasn't true. It was the role of the scapegoat he needed me to play. I did not yell back. I did not defend myself. That, I now understood, was the trap. Instead, I found a small, quiet space inside myself. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it was firm. "But I'm not going to be yelled at. I'm ending this conversation now." And I hung up the phone. The storm that followed was intense. I was ostracized, the subject of furious gossip. For a couple of weeks, it felt like I'd lost my family. And in a way, I had. I'd lost the family that required me to be their emotional punching bag. The grief over that loss was real. But beneath the grief, a new feeling was taking root: self-respect. I had weathered the storm. I had held my boundary. I had proven to myself that their discomfort was not my problem to fix. In the quiet aftermath of that hurricane, I realized I wasn't just surviving. I was finally beginning to live. After the storm passed, I realized one successful no wasn't the end of the war. To truly reclaim my life, I needed a strategy. I had to understand the mechanics of what a healthy boundary actually was. I learned that setting boundaries isn't an act of aggression. It's an act of profound self-respect. My first lesson was learning to spot the jade trap. Justify, argue, defend, explain. For years, jade was my go-to. They'd make a critical comment, and I'd immediately start justifying my position, arguing my point, defending my character, and explaining my reasoning. I finally understood that jade is not communication. It's a plea for validation from people who will never give it. Toxic people don't want your reasons. Your reasons are just ammunition. They're footholds they can use to climb over your walls. When you explain you're too busy, they'll help you rearrange your schedule. The moment I stopped explaining, I took away their power. So, I developed a new toolkit of simple, non-negotiable phrases. When my aunt asked why I hadn't been at the dinner instead of my work excuse, I said, "I know you were disappointed I wasn't there. That time just didn't work for me." When she pressed for the real reason, I just said, "I'm not going to discuss it, but I hope you can respect my decision." When my mom tried to guilt me into a weekend visit I didn't have the energy for, my new response was, "That weekend won't be possible, but I'd love to schedule a phone call with you next week." I offered an alternative that worked for me, without justifying why the original plan didn't. It wasn't about pure rejection. It was about redirecting the interaction to terms I could accept. The hardest script was for handling direct criticism. During one call, my dad made a snide remark about my spending. The old me would have defended the purchase and ended the call feeling small. The new me took a breath and said, "Dad, please don't comment on my finances." When he scoffed and said, "I'm just trying to help," I didn't take the bait. I stated the consequence. "I know you might think you're helping, but if you bring it up again, I'm going to end the call." And that was the revelation. A boundary is only as strong as the consequence you're willing to enforce. I also learned to set boundaries ahead of time. I knew holidays were a minefield. Before Thanksgiving, I called my mom and said, "I'm really looking forward to seeing everyone. I just want to let you know that I won't be participating in any conversations about my personal life. If those topics come up, I'll just be stepping away for some air." I was setting the rules for my own participation instead of walking into an ambush unprepared. Enforcing these boundaries was terrifying at first. It felt so selfish because I was conditioned to believe my job was to keep everyone else comfortable. I had to learn to tolerate their discomfort. When I ended a call or walked out of a room, they'd often get angry or play the victim. I had to constantly remind myself their reaction is their responsibility. It was a practice of emotional detachment, not from a place of coldness, but from a place of self-preservation. This process was like exercising a new muscle. It was shaky and painful at first, but with each repetition, it got easier. Each time I held a boundary, I was sending a message to myself. My needs matter. I have the right to take up space in my own life. Setting boundaries created a huge shift in my family. For some, it led to a grudging, awkward, but ultimately workable new reality. My sister, after a few more failed attempts to pull me into the old drama, eventually started to interact with me on my new terms. Our conversations became more superficial, but they were also more peaceful. We found new, safer ground to stand on. This was low contact, a deliberate choice to reduce how often and how deeply we interacted to a level I could handle. But for others, my boundaries weren't a map to a new relationship. They were a declaration of war. My father was the primary resistor. He simply could not or would not operate outside the old dynamic of control. Every conversation was a battle. He would relentlessly test my boundaries, pushing on the very topics I had declared off limits, as if trying to prove my rules didn't apply to him. If I said, "I'm not discussing my career," he'd say, "Well, you should, because you're making bad decisions." If I ended a call when he started yelling, he'd leave a string of angry voicemails. For about a year, I tried to maintain a low-contact relationship with him. I saw him only at large family gatherings. I kept phone calls brief, but every single interaction left me feeling drained and anxious. It was like knowingly touching a hot stove, hoping this time it wouldn't burn me. It always did. The low-contact strategy wasn't working because he was constantly trying to force full contact on his terms. The breaking point came during a tense family dinner. He started making critical comments not just about me, but about my partner in front of everyone. I calmly said, "Dad, we've talked about this. I will not allow you to speak about me or my partner this way. He laughed, a dismissive, cruel sound. Oh, here we go again with the boundaries, he sneered, using air quotes. You are in my house, and I will say what I want. In that moment, everything became crystal clear. He was never going to change. He wasn't interested in a relationship with me, the adult woman. He was only interested in maintaining his power over me, the scapegoated child. Continuing to engage with him, even a little bit, was an act of self-harm. I was giving him repeated opportunities to hurt me, and he was taking every single one. That night, I went home and grieved. I wasn't grieving the man who was my father. I was grieving the father I had always wished he would be. I was letting go of the fantasy of a respectful relationship that I had clung to for decades. And in letting go of that fantasy, I found the freedom to accept the reality. This relationship was toxic, and it was never going to be fixed. A few days later, I wrote him a short, simple letter. It wasn't angry. It wasn't a list of his mistakes. It wasn't another explanation. It was a simple statement of my final boundary. I wrote that for my own well-being, I could no longer have him in my life. I wished him peace, but stated that I would not be in contact, and I would not accept any contact from him. Then, I blocked his number, I blocked his email, I blocked him on social media. I took the final, terrifying step of going no contact. This decision wasn't made lightly. Society often shames people who cut ties with family. But I learned that, sometimes, cutting ties isn't about closing a door on someone else. It's about opening a door for yourself. It's about creating the space you need to finally heal. It was the most radical act of self-love I had ever committed. It was me, finally, choosing myself. The first few months of no contact were strange. They were filled with a deafening silence and a profound sense of peace. My nervous system, so used to being on high alert, slowly began to learn what safety felt like. The constant hum of anxiety that had been the soundtrack to my life finally started to fade. The most incredible change was the reclamation of my own mind. Before, my head was a crowded, noisy place, filled with the anticipated judgments of my family. Every decision was run through a filter. What would they think? How would I defend this? Now, that filter was just gone. For the first time, I could actually hear my own voice. And it turned out my own voice was calm and kind. I started making choices, big and small, just for me. I bought a piece of art I loved without worrying if it was too weird. I booked a solo trip abroad, something I'd always dreamed of but had been too afraid to do because of the inevitable lectures. I found so much joy in just living a life that didn't require a defense. My existence was no longer a thesis I had to prove. It was simply a fact. This freedom rippled out into all my other relationships. I became more present and authentic with my friends. My relationship with my partner deepened because I was no longer dragging the stress of my family drama into our home. He had known and loved the guarded, defensive version of me. Now he got to know the real me, and our connection flourished. Healing wasn't a straight line. There were moments of grief, especially around holidays, when the absence of what a family should be felt sharp. Therapy was a huge help, allowing me to process the trauma and build a sense of self-worth that didn't come from anyone else. I learned to reparent myself, giving myself the unconditional love I never got as a child. The most surprising part was rediscovering my own identity. For so long, I'd been defined by my role in the family drama. The difficult one, the sensitive one, the burden. Without that role, I was free to find out who I actually was. I discovered I was resilient. I was creative. I was adventurous. I was a person worthy of respect, not because I'd earned it through perfect obedience, but simply because I existed. Today, my life isn't perfect, but it is mine. The feeling of being a burden has been replaced by a quiet confidence. I no longer feel like I have to apologize for taking up space. My no is still a complete sentence. My peace is still my priority. And the energy I once spent on endless, fruitless explanations is now spent on building a life that feels joyful, authentic, and above all, free. My story is my own, but the feeling of being misunderstood, of being treated like a burden, is universal. If this resonated with you, I want you to know you are not alone. And the first step to reclaiming your power can be a small one. It can be just sharing your experience. The comments section is a space for you. Share one moment where you felt you had to over-explain yourself. Let's validate each other's experiences, because sometimes simply being seen is the beginning of healing. The journey from being a burden to being a boundary is long. It requires you to unlearn a lifetime of conditioning. It demands that you stand in the fire of other people's disapproval and not flinch. But what lies on the other side of that fire is an invaluable prize: yourself. Taking back your power doesn't always look like a triumphant victory. Sometimes it looks like a quiet no. Sometimes it looks like hanging up the phone. It's the realization that you can't control how other people treat you, but you can and must control whether you participate. You are not required to attend every argument you're invited to. If you are living under the weight of being a burden, know this: your needs are valid. Your feelings are legitimate. You do not owe anyone an explanation for the life you choose to live. Let your no be a complete sentence. Let your peace be non-negotiable. And let today be the day you stop explaining and start living.